The ballroom was filled with the kind of people you only see in magazines. Women wore dresses that probably cost more than a year's rent, and men stood around in perfectly fitted suits, holding crystal glasses and laughing at jokes that didn't seem all that funny. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, throwing sparkles of light across the marble floors. Everything in that room screamed money and status. In the far corner, near a table decorated with white roses, stood a woman who clearly didn't belong. Her name was Rebecca, and she was 52 years old. She wore a navy blue dress that had seen better days. It was the same dress she'd worn to her daughter's wedding 5 years ago, and if you looked closely, you could see where she'd mended a small tear near the hem. Her shoes were comfortable flats from a discount store, not the elegant heels clicking across the floor around her. She clutched a small borrowed purse against her side like it was a shield protecting her from all the wealth surrounding her. Rebecca was a piano teacher, not the kind who taught at fancy music academies or trained future concert stars. She taught kids in her neighborhood, mostly children whose parents scraped together $20 a week for lessons. She taught in living rooms, community centers, and sometimes in her own tiny apartment where the upright piano took up half the space. She'd been doing this for nearly 30 years, ever since she graduated from a local college with a music degree that everyone told her was useless. Tonight, she was here because of her younger sister, Linda. Linda had married well, as their mother used to say. Her husband owned a successful business, and they moved in circles that Rebecca only read about in the society pages. Linda had begged her to come to this charity gala, saying she needed family support and promising that Rebecca wouldn't feel out of place. That promise had been a lie, though Rebecca knew Linda meant well. Rebecca watched her sister float around the room, comfortable and confident, stopping to chat with this person and that. Everyone seemed to know Linda. Everyone seemed to belong except her. She took a small sip from her glass of champagne, which tasted expensive but didn't make her feel any less awkward. She'd been standing in this corner for almost 40 minutes, checking her watch every few minutes and calculating how soon she could leave without being rude. That's when her eyes landed on it. The grand piano sitting on the stage at the front of the ballroom. It was beautiful, a Steinway, black and glossy, positioned under a spotlight like a jewel on display. The bench sat empty before it, waiting. Just looking at it made Rebecca's fingers twitch. She'd spent her whole life playing piano, but never on an instrument like that. Her piano at home had sticky keys and a pedal that squeaked. The pianos she used for teaching were often out of tune and worn down by careless hands. A woman in a red sequined dress stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. The room gradually quieted down. She introduced herself as the event coordinator and thanked everyone for coming to support the Children's Hospital. There would be dinner, she said, followed by a special musical performance by a renowned pianist who had flown in from New York specifically for this event. The performance would be followed by the main fundraising auction. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Rebecca felt a small flutter of excitement. At least there would be music. That was something. She loved hearing good piano playing, even if it made her a little envious of performers who got to play for audiences, instead of teaching scales to distracted 10-year-olds. She settled in to wait, trying to look like she belonged. Dinner was served at round tables covered in white linen. Rebecca found herself seated between a banker and a real estate developer, both of whom spoke over her to each other about golf courses and vacation homes. She picked at her salmon and asparagus, nodding politely when anyone bothered to look her way. Linda, seated at a different table across the room, kept catching her eye and smiling apologetically. After dessert was cleared away, the coordinator returned to the stage. But this time, her smile looked forced. She tapped the microphone again, and the sound echoed through the room with an uncomfortable screech. Rebecca watched as the woman's professional composure seemed to crack just slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying a note of distress that everyone could hear, "I'm afraid I have some disappointing news. Our scheduled performer has fallen ill and won't be able to join us tonight." A wave of murmurs spread through the ballroom. People turned to their neighbors, eyebrows raised. This was clearly not part of the plan. The coordinator continued, talking quickly now, saying something about food poisoning in the hospital and how terribly sorry everyone was. She pulled out her phone right there on stage and started making calls, her back half turned to the audience, her voice urgent even though she was trying to whisper. Rebecca felt a strange pull in her chest as she watched the coordinator's growing panic. She looked at the piano again, still sitting there under its spotlight, silent and waiting. Her fingers twitched again. She'd played hundreds of concerts in her imagination, thousands of times while sitting alone at her apartment piano. She knew dozens of pieces by heart, could play them in her sleep. But this wasn't her world. These weren't her people. The voice in her head, the one that sounded like every person who'd ever told her she should have chosen a more practical career, told her to stay quiet. What would these wealthy people think if some unknown piano teacher volunteered? They'd probably laugh. She'd embarrass herself and, worse, embarrass Linda. The coordinator finished her calls and returned to the microphone. Her smile was gone completely now. "Unfortunately, we haven't been able to secure a replacement on such short notice. We'll proceed directly to the auction portion of our evening. We apologize for the inconvenience." The disappointment in the room was thick. People had come expecting entertainment, and now they were just getting a sales pitch for auction items. Rebecca heard someone at her table mutter that maybe they should have just stayed home. The coordinator stepped off the stage, looking defeated. That's when Rebecca felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Linda leaning down beside her chair, eyes bright with an idea that Rebecca immediately recognized as trouble. "You could do it," Linda whispered. Rebecca's heart started pounding. "Absolutely not." "Why not? You're amazing at piano. You know you are." "Linda, no. These people are expecting a professional from New York, not a neighborhood piano teacher. These people are expecting music, period, and you can give them that." Rebecca shook her head firmly, turning back to face forward. But Linda didn't move. She stayed there, her hand on Rebecca's shoulder, her presence a gentle pressure that wouldn't go away. And something strange happened. Rebecca thought about her mother who had worked as a housekeeper her entire life, cleaning other people's homes so Rebecca could take piano lessons. Her mother who used to say that talent wasn't about where you came from or who knew your name. It was about what you could give to the world when you had the chance. Rebecca looked at the piano one more time. Her hands had stopped trembling. In fact, they felt steady for the first time all evening. The voice telling her to stay quiet was still there. But another voice, one that sounded like her mother, was growing louder. Before she could talk herself out of it, before logic and fear could win, Rebecca pushed back her chair and stood up. Her legs felt shaky, but they were moving. She was walking toward the stage. She had no idea what would happen next, but she was done hiding in the corner. Every step toward that stage felt like walking through water. Rebecca's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in her temples. The ballroom wasn't that big, maybe 100 feet from her table to the stage, but it felt like miles. People were starting to notice her movement. Heads turned, conversations paused mid-sentence. What was she doing? This was insane. These people had paid hundreds of dollars for their tickets. They expected world-class entertainment, not some nobody from the East Side who taught "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" to 7-year-olds. Her mind screamed at her to turn around, sit back down, pretend she was just going to the restroom. But her feet kept moving. The event coordinator was near the stage stairs, talking intensely on her phone, probably still trying to find a replacement pianist. She looked up as Rebecca approached, and her expression shifted from stressed to confused. Rebecca could see the question in her eyes before she even asked it. "Can I help you?" the coordinator said, lowering her phone slightly. Her tone was polite, but dismissive. the way people talk when they're busy and don't have time for interruptions. Rebecca's mouth had gone completely dry. When she spoke, her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I heard you need someone to play. I can do it." The coordinator's eyebrows went up. She looked Rebecca up and down, taking in the old dress, the discount shoes, the complete lack of anything that suggested professional performer. For a moment, Rebecca saw something in her expression that stung. Doubt, maybe even pity. "That's very kind of you to offer," the coordinator said carefully. "But this is a formal event. We were expecting a concert pianist. Do you have performance experience?" Rebecca felt heat rising to her cheeks. This was it. This was the moment to back out gracefully, laugh it off, say she was just trying to help. But then she thought about all those years of practice, all those hours at the piano when she could have been doing anything else. All those times she'd played for herself in an empty room because no one else was listening. "I've been playing piano for 45 years, Rebecca said, and this time her voice came out stronger. "I teach it. I live it. I may not have fancy credentials, but I know I can give these people something worth listening to." The coordinator hesitated. Rebecca could see her mind working, weighing options. The woman glanced at her phone, then at the empty stage, then back at Rebecca. She was desperate. That much was clear. The evening was falling apart, and she needed to salvage something. "All right," she finally said, though she didn't sound convinced. "We don't have many options at this point. Can you play for about 20 minutes? "I can play for as long as you need," Rebecca said. The coordinator nodded and gestured toward the stage stairs. "Go ahead then. I'll introduce you." This was really happening. Rebecca climbed the 3 steps to the stage, and suddenly she was in the spotlight. Literally. The bright lights made it hard to see the audience clearly, which was probably a blessing. She could make out shapes, the glitter of jewelry, the white of tablecloths. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her. The coordinator stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're fortunate to have a volunteer pianist who has graciously offered to perform for us this evening." The applause that followed was polite but thin. Rebecca heard it for what it was: courtesy, not enthusiasm. Some people were already pulling out their phones, probably checking emails or scrolling through social media. A few were whispering to their table mates. She caught a glimpse of a man in the 3rd row smirking slightly, his arms crossed. Another woman was checking her watch. Rebecca walked to the piano bench and sat down. The bench was exactly the right height, perfectly cushioned. She ran her hand along the edge of the keyboard, not touching the keys yet. The piano was beautiful up close, pristine, and perfectly maintained. This was the kind of instrument she dreamed about as a young girl when she practiced on her grandmother's beat-up old upright. She adjusted the bench slightly, buying herself a few more seconds. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, willing them to be steady. In the audience, she could hear chairs scraping, glasses clinking. People weren't even bothering to be quiet. They'd already decided this was going to be mediocre at best, something to endure before getting to the real purpose of the evening, the auction. And maybe they were right. Maybe she'd been crazy to volunteer. She was about to make a fool of herself in front of all these important people, and Linda would never forgive her. And tomorrow she'd wake up and have to face the fact that she'd embarrassed herself at the biggest event she'd ever attended. Rebecca closed her eyes. She thought about her first piano teacher, Mrs. Chen, who had taught her when she was 6 years old. Mrs. Chen used to say that the piano didn't care about your fancy clothes or your important friends. The piano only cared about the truth you brought to it. She thought about her mother, gone now for 8 years, who used to sit on a folding chair in their cramped living room and listen to Rebecca practice for hours. Her mother, who never got to wear fancy dresses or attend elegant parties, but who believed that music was the most valuable thing a person could share. She thought about all her students over the years, the shy ones who found confidence through music. The troubled ones who found peace, the lonely ones who found expression. She'd given them something real, even if the world didn't think teaching piano in low-income neighborhoods was impressive. Rebecca opened her eyes. Her hands had stopped shaking. She lifted them to the keyboard and let them hover there for just a moment. She'd already decided what she would play. Not something flashy or showy, not something meant to impress. She would play what she loved, what she felt, what was true. She placed her fingers on the keys. The room wasn't quite silent, but it was quieter now. People were waiting, some probably expecting disaster, others just bored and patient. Rebecca took one deep breath. She thought about every scale she'd ever practiced, every difficult passage she'd worked through. Every morning she'd woken up early to play before heading to her teaching jobs. All of it had led to this moment. This unlikely, impossible, terrifying moment. And then she pressed down on the first key. The note that came out was pure and clear, filling the ballroom with a richness that made something shift in the air. It was a single note, held for just the right amount of time before her other fingers joined in and the melody began to unfold. She was playing Chopin, the Nocturne in E-flat major. It was a piece she'd learned 20 years ago and had played hundreds of times since. She knew every note, every phrase, every place where the composer had hidden little moments of heartbreak and hope. Her fingers moved across the keys with a sureness that came from muscle memory deeper than thought. The second phrase came, then the third. Rebecca wasn't thinking anymore. She was just playing, just letting the music pour out of her the way it always did when she was alone. She forgot about the audience. She forgot about her old dress and borrowed purse. She forgot about being out of place. She was home. This was where she'd always belonged, at a piano, making music. And in the ballroom, something was changing. Phones were being lowered. Conversations were stopping. People were turning in their seats to see who was making these sounds because this wasn't what they'd expected at all. This was something else entirely. The music flowed through Rebecca's fingers like water finding its path. Each note seemed to bloom in the air, soft at first, then growing stronger, more confident. The Chopin Nocturne was a conversation between light and shadow, between sadness and comfort, and Rebecca knew how to speak both languages fluently. In the third row, the man who had been smirking stopped mid-sip of his wine. His glass hung in the air, forgotten, as his eyes fixed on the woman at the piano. The expression on his face had changed completely. The smugness was gone, replaced by something closer to surprise. A woman near the back who had been texting under the table slowly lowered her phone to her lap. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, then the screen went dark. She leaned forward slightly in her chair, as if getting closer might help her understand what she was hearing. Rebecca's fingers danced through a particularly difficult passage, a cascade of notes that tumbled like water over stones. She'd always loved this part, the way it required both precision and feeling. Too mechanical and it sounded empty, too loose and it fell apart. But when you got it right, when you found that perfect balance, it was like capturing something beautiful and setting it free at the same time. The room had gone completely quiet now. The clinking of silverware had stopped. The whispered conversations had died away. Even the waiters standing along the walls had paused in their work, trays balanced on their hands, listening. Linda sat at her table with tears already forming in her eyes. She'd heard her sister play countless times over the years, in living rooms and at family gatherings, but never like this. Never with this kind of freedom. It was like watching someone who'd been holding their breath for 30 years finally exhale. An older gentleman in the front row closed his eyes, his hand resting on his chest. He'd been a music lover his whole life, had attended hundreds of concerts in the world's finest halls. He knew the difference between technical skill and something more. This woman, whoever she was, had both. But more than that, she had something that couldn't be taught. She had soul. Rebecca moved into the middle section of the Nocturne, where the melody became more introspective, more personal. Her left hand provided a steady heartbeat, while her right hand sang out the story. This was the part that always made her think of her mother, of late nights when she was young and her mother would sit beside her while she practiced, never complaining about the repetition, never telling her it was too late or too loud. She remembered her mother's hands, rough from years of cleaning houses, resting on her lap while she listened. Her mother had never learned to play an instrument herself, but she understood music in a way that went beyond notes on a page. She understood that it was about expressing things that words couldn't reach. A woman at table 5 reached for her husband's hand. She didn't know why exactly, but the music was doing something to her, opening up feelings she normally kept locked away. Her husband squeezed back, and they sat there holding hands like they hadn't done in years, both of them lost in the sound. The event coordinator stood frozen at the side of the stage. She'd been prepared to give this volunteer pianist maybe 5 minutes before gracefully cutting her off and moving on to the auction. But now she couldn't move. She couldn't interrupt this. Her phone buzzed in her pocket with messages. Probably the event organizers asking about the schedule, but she ignored it. Rebecca's eyes were still closed. She was somewhere else entirely now, in that space where time moved differently. She was 17 again, playing her college audition. She was 25, teaching her first student. She was 38, playing at her mother's funeral when no one else could, because she was the only one who could say goodbye through music instead of words. She was every age she'd ever been, and every version of herself was here in this moment, at this piano, finally being heard. The nocturne built toward its emotional peak, the place where the composer had written a pause that required perfect timing. Hold it too long, and you lost the momentum. Release it too quickly, and you missed the meaning. Rebecca held it for exactly the right amount of time, letting the silence speak as loudly as the notes. In that silence, someone in the audience let out a small gasp. It was barely audible, but in the complete quiet of the room, it carried. Others felt it too. That moment of suspension where everything hung in the balance. Then Rebecca's fingers moved again, bringing the melody back, but softer now, like a memory returning. The nocturne was ending, winding its way toward resolution. The left hand slowed its rhythm. The right hand climbed higher on the keyboard, reaching for something beautiful and distant. A young waiter standing by the kitchen doors felt tears on his cheeks and quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. He was 19 years old and working 3 jobs to pay for community college. He'd never been to a classical music concert before, had never understood what the big deal was. But this he understood. This was about struggling and surviving and still finding something beautiful in the world. The final phrases of the nocturne floated through the air like leaves falling. Each note was perfectly placed, perfectly weighted. Rebecca's hands moved with the kind of grace that only came from a lifetime of devotion. This wasn't just skill. This was love made audible. The last chord hung in the air, rich and full and final. Rebecca held it, letting it fade naturally, not cutting it off too soon. She wanted to give it space to breathe, to complete its journey. Her foot stayed on the sustain pedal, letting the strings vibrate until they had nothing left to give. And then, silence. Complete and total silence. Rebecca kept her hands on the keys, kept her eyes closed. She wasn't ready to come back yet, wasn't ready to return to the ballroom and all those watching eyes. For just a few more seconds, she wanted to stay in this peaceful place where only music existed. But reality was waiting. She could feel it pressing in on her. She'd have to open her eyes eventually. She'd have to face whatever came next. Maybe polite applause. Maybe disappointment that she hadn't been the New York performer they'd expected. Maybe nothing at all. She took a deep breath and slowly lifted her hands from the keyboard. They were steady now, completely steady, even though her heart was racing. She opened her eyes and blinked against the spotlight, trying to adjust to the brightness. The silence continued. Rebecca's stomach dropped. This was worse than polite applause. This was nothing. They'd hated it. She'd been completely wrong about everything. She started to turn, started to stand up from the bench, already planning how quickly she could get off this stage and out of this building. And then it happened. One person started clapping, then another, then 5 more, then 20, then the entire room erupted. But it wasn't just applause. People were standing up, pushing back their chairs, getting to their feet. The sound was thunderous, overwhelming, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and marble floors. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" and others joined in. The older gentleman in the front row was wiping his eyes openly, not caring who saw. Rebecca stood at the piano, completely stunned. Her hands flew to her mouth. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. These people, these wealthy, sophisticated people who'd come expecting a world-class performer, were giving her a standing ovation. Linda was on her feet, clapping so hard her hands hurt, tears streaming down her face. The event coordinator stood off to the side, her own eyes wet, a huge smile on her face that said she couldn't believe what had just happened. The applause went on and on. People wouldn't stop. They couldn't stop. Some were looking at their neighbors with expressions of amazement, silently asking, "Did you hear that? Did that really just happen?" Rebecca's vision blurred with tears. She tried to say thank you, but her voice wouldn't work. All she could do was stand there, overwhelmed, while the room celebrated what she'd given them. She'd spent 30 years being invisible, being the background, being the person nobody noticed. And now, for these few minutes, she'd been seen. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Rebecca stood beside the piano, her hand resting on its polished surface for support because her legs suddenly felt unsteady. She'd imagined this moment countless times in her life, the moment when people truly listened to her play, but the reality was so much more overwhelming than any fantasy could have been. Finally, the applause began to fade, but people remained standing. The event coordinator hurried onto the stage, her professional composure mixed with genuine excitement. She reached Rebecca and gently touched her arm. "That was extraordinary," she whispered. "Would you play something else? Please?" Rebecca looked out at the audience. They were waiting, hoping. The same people who had been checking their phones and whispering to each other 15 minutes ago were now completely focused on her. She saw faces that had been closed and distant now open and eager. It was like seeing flowers turn toward the sun. "Yes," Rebecca heard herself say. "I can play more." The coordinator squeezed her arm gratefully and stepped back. Rebecca returned to the bench and settled herself again. This time there was no fear, no trembling hands. Something had shifted inside her. She'd crossed a bridge and couldn't go back, didn't want to go back. She decided to play something different this time, something with more energy and life. Her fingers found the opening notes of a Debussy prelude, one that sparkled and danced like light on water. Where the Chopin had been introspective and emotional, this was pure joy. It was the sound of a spring morning, of possibility, of hope. Her hands flew across the keyboard with confidence now. The difficult runs that had taken her months to master years ago flowed out effortlessly. She swayed slightly as she played, her whole body moving with the music. This was how she played when she was alone, when no one was watching, and she could be completely free. In the audience, phones started coming out, but not to check messages or scroll through social media. People were recording. A woman in her 30s held up her phone with shaking hands, trying to capture what she was witnessing. A man in the back did the same, wanting to remember this moment, to prove to himself later that it had really happened. The young waiter who'd cried during the first piece was recording too, holding his phone low by his side so his manager wouldn't see. He was thinking about his own dreams, his own struggles. If this ordinary-looking woman could create something this beautiful, maybe he could make something of his life too. Maybe being from nowhere and having nothing didn't mean you couldn't do something that mattered. Rebecca moved into a section that required her hands to cross over each other in a complex pattern. She'd practiced this part hundreds of times, but it still thrilled her every time she got it right. The notes tumbled out in a cascade of sound that seemed impossible for two hands to create. At table 7, a man leaned over to his wife. "Do you know who she is?" he whispered. His wife shook her head. "I've never seen her before, but whoever she is, she's remarkable." The man nodded slowly. He ran a hedge fund and was used to evaluating talent, spotting winners. This woman was extraordinary, and somehow she'd been hidden away, unknown. It seemed wrong, almost criminal. He made a mental note to find out more about her. Rebecca finished the Debussy and immediately flowed into something else, a piece by Rachmaninoff that was both powerful and tender. She wasn't thinking about what to play, wasn't planning or analyzing. She was just following her instincts, playing what felt right in the moment. This piece was darker, more complex. The left hand pounded out deep bass notes, while the right hand soared high above. It was like a conversation between earth and sky, between struggle and transcendence. Rebecca poured everything into it, all the years of obscurity, all the times she'd wondered if her life had meaning. All the students she'd taught who'd gone on to quit music because their parents thought it was impractical. The music built and built, getting louder and more intense. Her hands were moving so fast they were almost a blur. Sweat formed on her forehead. She didn't care. She was giving everything she had, holding nothing back. A woman in the audience felt goosebumps rise on her arms. She was a music teacher, too, at a prestigious academy uptown where parents paid thousands of dollars per month. She'd always thought she was doing important work, but watching this woman play with such pure, unfiltered passion made her realize she'd lost something along the way. She'd forgotten why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. The Rachmaninoff reached its climax, a series of massive chords that required Rebecca to use her entire body weight. She came down on the keys with force, and the piano responded with a sound that filled every corner of the ballroom. The chandeliers seemed to shake. The floor seemed to vibrate. And then, just as suddenly, the music became quiet again. Rebecca's hands moved to the upper register of the piano, playing a simple melody that was almost childlike in its purity. After all that power and complexity, this simplicity was even more moving. It was like watching a storm pass and seeing the first rays of sunshine break through the clouds. Linda was openly sobbing now, not caring who saw. She'd spent so many years feeling like she needed to apologize for her sister, like Rebecca's choice to be a piano teacher instead of something more prestigious was embarrassing. But watching her now, seeing what she could do, Linda felt ashamed of every time she'd minimized Rebecca's talent, every time she'd suggested maybe Rebecca should think about a different career. The older gentleman in the front row was thinking about his own daughter, who'd wanted to be a painter, but whom he'd pushed into law school. She was a successful attorney now, made good money, but she was miserable. He saw in Rebecca what his daughter might have become if he'd let her follow her heart. The regret sat heavy in his chest. Rebecca played for 40 minutes straight. She moved through pieces by different composers, different eras, different moods. She played things she'd learned decades ago and things she'd just mastered last month. She played for all the students who'd never gotten a chance to shine. She played for her mother. She played for every version of herself that had sat alone at a piano, wondering if anyone would ever really hear her. Finally, she played one last piece, a simple folk melody that her grandmother had taught her when she was very young. It was the first song she'd ever learned, before she'd known anything about technique or theory. She played it exactly the way her grandmother had played it, with a straightforward honesty that needed no embellishment. When the last note faded, Rebecca lifted her hands and let them fall into her lap. She was exhausted but felt more alive than she had in years. She turned slowly to face the audience. They rose to their feet again, every single person in the room. The applause was even louder than before. Several people were wiping their eyes. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief, as if they couldn't quite process what they'd just experienced. Rebecca stood up from the bench and took a small bow. She wasn't graceful about it, wasn't practiced like a professional performer would be. But that somehow made it even more touching. She was just a woman who loved music, sharing what she had. The event coordinator rushed to the stage again with a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Can we know your name? Who are you?" Rebecca took the microphone with trembling hands. The spotlight was hot on her face. She could see hundreds of eyes looking at her, waiting. "My name is Rebecca," she said simply. "I teach piano in the Riverside neighborhood. I've been teaching for 30 years. The room burst into applause again. Someone shouted, "Where can we hear you play again?" Others called out similar questions. The coordinator tried to restore order, but was having trouble. What Rebecca didn't know was that everything had changed. Those phones recording in the audience would upload their videos within hours. By morning, she would wake up to a world she didn't recognize. But in this moment, she just stood there, overwhelmed and grateful, finally feeling like all those years of dedication had meant something after all. Rebecca barely slept that night. She kept replaying the evening in her mind, unable to believe it had really happened. Linda had driven her home, both of them too emotional to talk much. Before Rebecca got out of the car, Linda had hugged her tight and whispered, "I'm so proud of you. I'm so sorry I never told you that enough." Now Rebecca sat at her small kitchen table in her apartment drinking tea as the sun came up. Her cat, Oliver, wound between her legs, sensing something different about his owner. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday morning. The same chipped countertop, the same faded curtains, the same stack of student workbooks waiting to be reviewed. But Rebecca felt different. She felt like she'd been asleep for 30 years and had finally woken up. Her phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. She picked it up, confused. Text messages were flooding in from numbers she didn't recognize. She opened one. "Is this the piano teacher from last night? I was at the gala. Your performance changed my life." Another one. "Please tell me you give concerts. I need to hear you play again." And another. "My daughter has been taking piano lessons for 3 years and wants to quit. I just showed her your video. She's practicing right now. Thank you." Video? What video? Rebecca's hands shook as she opened her social media app. She barely used it, mostly just looked at pictures Linda posted of her kids. But now her notification count showed 847. Her heart started racing. Someone had posted one of the recordings from last night. The video showed her sitting at the piano in her navy blue dress, playing the Chopin Nocturne. But it wasn't just one video. There were dozens of them, posted by different people who'd been in the audience. And they were being shared everywhere. One video had been viewed 2 million times. 2 million. Rebecca stared at the number, sure it must be a mistake. She clicked on the comments. "I've been to Carnegie Hall. This is better than half the performers I've seen there. Who is this woman? How have we never heard of her? This is what real music sounds like, not the overproduced garbage we usually hear. I'm crying. I don't even know why. This just hit something deep." The comments went on, thousands of them. Rebecca set down her phone, feeling dizzy. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. But it was real. Over the next few days, her phone never stopped ringing. A producer from a morning talk show wanted her to come on and tell her story. A concert promoter from Chicago said he could book her in a venue that seated 2,000 people. A recording company wanted to discuss a contract. A prestigious music academy offered her a position as an artist in residence, whatever that meant. Rebecca felt overwhelmed by it all. She sat at her piano, the one with the sticky keys and squeaky pedal, and tried to process what was happening. Part of her wanted to ignore everything, to go back to her quiet life teaching lessons. But another part of her, the part that had walked onto that stage despite being terrified, knew she couldn't hide anymore. The story got picked up by news outlets. "Unknown piano teacher stuns high society crowd," one headline read. "Viral pianist spent 30 years in obscurity," said another. Reporters wanted to interview her, to know why she'd never pursued a performing career, why she'd stayed in her neighborhood teaching kids when she clearly had this gift. Rebecca didn't know how to explain it. She'd never thought she was good enough. She'd never believed anyone would want to hear her play. She'd thought her job was to teach others, to pass on what she knew, not to perform herself. It seemed silly now, but that was the truth. A week after the gala, Rebecca received a call that made her hands shake. It was from the manager of the Riverside Community Center, where she taught most of her lessons. The woman's voice was excited. "Rebecca, you won't believe this. Someone just donated $250,000 to renovate our music room. They want to name it after your mother. They said they were at the gala and were inspired by your story." Rebecca had to sit down. Her mother's name on a music room. Her mother, who'd cleaned houses so Rebecca could have lessons, who'd never complained about the sacrifice, who'd believed music was the most important thing a person could share with the world. More surprises came. A scholarship fund was established in her mother's name to provide free piano lessons to children who couldn't afford them. 3 of her former students, now adults, reached out to tell her how much her teaching had meant to them. One had become a music therapist, another taught elementary school music. The third played piano at a church and said it brought him peace after a difficult divorce. Rebecca realized that even in her obscurity, she'd made a difference. Those 30 years hadn't been wasted, but now she had a chance to reach even more people. She decided to say yes to some of the opportunities. Not all of them. She didn't want to become some celebrity who'd forgotten where she came from, but she could do a few concerts. She could make a recording. She could use whatever platform she'd been given to show people that music wasn't just for the elite, wasn't just for people who went to expensive schools and had important connections. Her first real concert was scheduled at a mid-sized concert hall downtown. Tickets sold out in 2 hours. Rebecca stood backstage before the performance, wearing a new dress that Linda had insisted on buying her, and felt the same nervousness she'd felt at the gala. But this time, she knew what was on the other side of that fear. She walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. The audience was different from the gala crowd. She saw families, students, elderly people, young couples. She saw people who looked like they'd saved up to buy tickets. She saw people who looked like her. Rebecca sat at the piano and spoke into the microphone. "Thank you all for coming. I spent most of my life thinking nobody wanted to hear me play. I was wrong. But more importantly, I want you to know that if you have something you love, something you're good at, it's never too late to share it. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait until you feel ready. Just do it." The applause was immediate and warm. Then Rebecca began to play. 6 months later, Rebecca's life had found a new balance. She'd recorded an album that people seemed to love. She performed concerts once or twice a month. But most importantly, she still taught. She'd cut back her schedule, but kept her favorite students, the ones who reminded her why she'd fallen in love with teaching in the first place. She'd also started teaching a free class at the community center on Saturday mornings for anyone who wanted to learn. Some of her students were children. Others were adults who'd always dreamed of playing piano but thought they were too old. Rebecca told them the same thing every week. "It's never too late. I'm living proof." One Saturday, a young girl approached her after class. She was maybe 10 years old, shy, wearing clothes that had clearly been passed down from an older sibling. "Miss Rebecca," the girl said quietly, My mom can't afford lessons, but I really want to learn. I watched your video, and it made me feel something I can't explain." Rebecca knelt down to the girl's level. She saw herself at that age, full of hunger for music, full of dreams she didn't quite dare to speak out loud. "What's your name?" Rebecca asked. "Sophie." "Well, Sophie, you know what? I teach here for free every Saturday. But if you want extra help, you come to my apartment on Tuesday afternoons. No charge. We'll work together until you're so good you can teach others. Deal?" The girl's eyes went wide. "Really? You'd do that?" "Someone did it for me once," Rebecca said. "Now it's my turn to do it for you." As Sophie ran off to tell her mother the good news, Rebecca felt something settle in her chest. This was what the gala had really been about. Not the fame or the opportunities or the recognition, though those were nice. It was about remembering that music was meant to be shared, that gifts were meant to be given away, that it was never too late to become who you were always meant to be. She'd spent 30 years teaching in obscurity. Now she'd spend the rest of her life teaching in the light, and every single student, every single concert, every single moment at the piano would be dedicated to her mother, who'd believed in her when she was too young to believe in herself. The world had discovered Rebecca. But more importantly, Rebecca had discovered that she'd had value all along. She'd just needed one moment of courage to show it. And that made all the difference.